Today, we become legends.
In the OP4 update, a change was sort of slipped in last minute without much of a chance to provide feedback, and unfortunately, I think it's one of the worst changes they've made to Smite 2 so far, so let's talk about it. So this is the change. They call it minion spawn protection, but it's basically an anti-proxying mechanic that is very reminiscent of Invader's Curse from Smite 1, which I'll explain more in a second. So this change basically adds a stack of 25% damage reduction and 100% physical power per remaining tower in a lane to the minions, and these stacks are removed one by one as they pass through a friendly tower. So by the time the wave comes out of the enemy tier 1, it's back to normal. Between the enemy tier 1 and tier 2, they have 1 stack, and behind the tier 2 and between the Phoenix, they have 2 stacks. This doesn't appear to have any kind of limit or cap. When I first saw this change, I assumed it was only for the first wave in order to curve level 1 proxy strategies, which I could almost sort of get behind. I still think it's unnecessary, and level 1 proxy strategies come with their own inherent risks and aren't anywhere near as popular or overpowered enough to warrant such of a change. But not only does this apply to the first wave, it applies to all waves forever, basically nerfing proxying for the entire laning phase. Once a tower is destroyed, the minions lose a stack of this protection, and again once the tier 2 goes down, but you would only have a proxy during the laning phase anyway, so this just completely guts the strategy for seemingly no reason. Just in case some of you aren't familiar, proxying is farming waves behind enemy towers. It's a high risk but high reward strategy as you take out the enemy wave several seconds ahead of when you normally could, which gives you additional time to take local camps, invade the enemy jungle, or start your rotation while the enemy is still waiting for your own wave to leave your tier 1 tower. Meaning they either follow your rotation and lose a whole wave, or they wait for the wave and be behind on your rotation, allowing you to potentially take a fight with a man advantage. It's an interesting strategy that is mostly done in solo lane due to solo laners being typically tankier and less gankable, and the solo lane tier 1 being further up the lane, meaning you have to overextend less in order to proxy. It's occasionally done in other roles, but 90% of the time it's a solo lane thing for the reasons I just listed. As I said at the start of the video, this change really reminds me of the Invader's Curse in Smite 1, in that it's an extremely ham-fisted, bull in a china shop style approach that doesn't attempt to find a nuanced way to balance the strategy in favor of just removing it from the game entirely. That's a tad hyperbolic. I don't think this change entirely removes the ability to proxy, but it makes it massively more difficult, and that was clearly the intent of this change, as it's so specific, only affecting minions behind enemy towers. The intent here is clearly to destroy proxying as a strategy, because they either can or don't want to find a way to balance it, much like Invader's Curse in Smite 1. There's a lot of parallels between these two changes. Smite 1 invades were kind of annoying to deal with sometimes, but it's an interesting strategy that had risk and reward. You could potentially steal an enemy buff or even get a first blood putting that specific enemy behind, but you also risk putting all the invading members of your team behind as well, since the enemy team will be playing as normal and farming the map, shoving their waves into your tower, causing you to miss XP and gold. They could even counter invade your other side jungle after pushing the wave and you might not be able to respond. We've seen in Smite 2 that there's plenty of counterplay to level 1 invades, and the Invader's Curse was just a ham-fisted attempt to delete the strategy from the game entirely because they either don't want to balance it or were outright incapable of doing so. Level 1 invades did sort of become meta for a very brief time at the start of Smite 2, especially so in the Founder Series competitive circuit and very high level ranked games. At lower levels they weren't even much of a problem, to be honest, even at their peak when half of all pro matches involved a level 1 invade. Not much was even changed about this, to be honest. There are still more incentives to invade in Smite 2 compared to Smite 1, such as denying enemies their infamy progress on buffs, being able to stack buffs, so for example if the enemy duo lane invades speed, they could stack that on top of purple buff where you couldn't do that in Smite 1. The only real change was to Sunder, as they nerfed it pretty heavily, which was a fairly significant nerf to level 1 invading, but there's still big incentives to do so, and yet level 1 invading fell off massively and isn't even that common anymore. It still happens, but it's far from every game. I play at a fairly high level, currently around high diamond or low obsidian, and I rarely see level 1 invades, despite Invader's Curse not being a thing in Smite 2. This is because invades inherently come with a risk alongside their reward, much like proxying does. This proxying change is even worse in my opinion for 2 reasons. The first being that proxying is way less of a problem than invading was. I can genuinely see a reason why they might have wanted to completely delete level 1 invades. I can't really see a reason why they would want to delete proxying. The other reason is that this change isn't just for wave 1 level 1 proxying. This change affects proxying at all stages of the game, which is just highly unnecessary and ham-fisted. Removing strategies like this just dumbs the game down over time and moves the game more and more towards just sitting in lane farming waves for 20 minutes with no other way of getting a lead or playing well. Proxying outside of level 1 was already balanced and fine in my opinion. It gave you the opportunity to take a risk and be rewarded for it, rather than just passively farming minions endlessly until you start rotating. You put yourself behind an enemy tower with realistically only 2 routes out. If the enemy is warding and the enemy solo laner is calling out that you keep proxying, it's fairly easy to catch out enemies doing this and punish them for it. Are some picks better at this than others? Sure, some picks can get away with proxying much more freely due to high movement or exceptional wave clear or both, but that's just part of the game. I really don't think a change like this was necessary at all, and at the absolute most they should have just done this for wave 1 only. But personally, I haven't even seen that much level 1 proxying anyway, and I don't think it's really an issue. But if it was a major issue, then sure, I guess they could have done this as basically the invader's curse of wave proxying for wave 1 only. I don't like that, but I can almost see why they do it. But making it so this change affects proxying for the entire laning phase is just so anti-fun and anti-competitive. High-level players already hated the Smite 1 invader's curse for the way it completely curb-stomped a fairly legitimate strategy with risks and rewards. Imagine if it was the case that the invader's curse never turned off, or only turned off once the entire laning phase was over. That's sort of like what they're doing with this proxy change. High-level players hated it, and at lower levels of play, level 1 invades weren't really a thing anyway, so I just don't see the target market for these kind of changes. You don't change much, if anything, for the casual player, while gutting a legitimate competitive strategy for those that take the game seriously and play it with competition in mind. Even if level 1 proxying was identified as a problem, removing it from the game entirely for the whole laning phase is a massive overreaction, as proxying in general is not a problem and existed in Smite 1 for 12 years with no one really complaining about it, so I just don't see where this change is coming from at all. Forcing players to play the game in a way that the devs want them to play is usually not a good idea for competitive games. Emergent design and strategies makes the game more interesting, and other strategies can and do emerge to counter those strategies, and so on as the game evolves. In very specific problem cases, dev intervention can be good, like for example, if backdoor protections never existed and split pushing was by far the most effective way to win a game no matter the situation, I would be totally fine with them adding backdoor protections as a solution. It is ham-fisted, but would probably be necessary if that situation was a reality. However, in this case, I just don't see the major issue with proxying that warrants this kind of change. They're just removing an interesting and mostly balanced strategy from the game for no reason in my eyes. It's very anti-fun and anti-competitive. I guess you could make the argument that new or less experienced players won't have the know-how or coordination to deal with a proxying enemy, and it could be frustrating. But in reality, how many low-level players are even proxying in the first place? Probably not that many. It's a slightly more advanced strategy that is only really prevalent in intermediate or especially higher level lobbies. And at that point, the players in those lobbies should be experienced enough to know how to deal with it, as it's not like proxying is this uncounterable, overpowered strategy that just wins you the game every time you do it. There are ways to play around and punish it that higher level players should be aware of, and if they're not, then they deserve to lose to the better players who are aware of this stuff. That's what a competitive game is at a high level of play, and for lower levels of play, I really don't think people are proxying all that much anyway, so I don't really see the point of this change. But what do you think about this change? I saw a lot of discussion about it on Twitter and in my chat on stream yesterday, and wanted to voice my own opinion on why I think this change is bad and explain it in detail for those that might not fully understand proxying and why it's not a bad thing to have in the game. Let me know your own thoughts down below, and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.